Welcome to episode 4, and this is the second half of my conversation with Laura Everett, who is the executive director of the Massachusetts Council of Churches. You probably want to listen to episode 3 first, although you could just kind of jump in the middle of our conversation. I divided this into 2 sections just because I like to keep my podcasts around a half an hour in length. This one is not quite a half hour, it's about 20 minutes, but I think it works to break it into 2 conversations. And so this is the second half of that conversation with Laura Everett, who is the author of Holy Spokes, a wonderful book on urban spirituality that if you haven't read that or if you want to learn a little bit about that, I actually did a YouTube video with her when that book came out last April 2017. You can go there. Great book on building community and bicycles as a vehicle for doing that. So Laura Everett is the executive director of the Massachusetts Council of Churches. She's been doing that for about 6 or 7 years. We had a great conversation following a wonderful worship service in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So anyway, let's get right to it, and we'll see you about halfway through a little bit of an interlude, but I'll leave that as a surprise.
I think one of the gifts of getting to visit churches from a wide range of traditions and a wide range of sizes and configurations is you get to see the places where there's life and vitality, and you also see the places where an overabundance becomes a stumbling block. I'm not going to name names, but I can think of a couple of churches that I've visited where they felt like they had everything they needed. They had enough people, or maybe it was a little less than it used to be. They owned the building, they had a nice parking lot, they had a full-time pastor. They used to have a full-time associate pastor, but now they're down to a half-time. So you could start to see the edges fraying a little, but they had enough that they didn't feel, sometimes, they didn't feel like they needed to depend on God. And there's a sort of mythology, I might even cross it over into heresy, that says that it's our hard work and our wisdom that makes this place work. And I don't find any of that pretense in new church starts, in immigrant communities, in more economically impoverished communities, because they know that their ability to gather, to have a roof over the head of the place they worship, if they do, is but for the grace of God. They have a sense of actually needing God, being sustained and supported by the workings of the Holy Spirit. They don't take for granted things. I have a deep fondness for scrappy churches because they know that this could fall apart. Like we're one check or one roof collapse or one
generous donor family
moving somewhere else away from. And they know that it is because of the grace of God that put breath in their lungs that morning and got them to church on Sunday and got them to the feeding pantry on Tuesday.
So are we saying, and I think you're right, everything you just said, are we saying that the coming economic crisis of the mainline churches in America is quite possibly the cleansing fire that will bring renewal to those expressions of Christianity? I mean, if so, then you and I both know that's a 50 to 100 year project.
Yeah. I mean, look, I don't wish the loss of jobs, the vacating of sacred spaces, the ending of faithful ministries. I don't wish that on congregations. We're in Greater Boston where 2 seminaries have closed or moved over the past 2 years, and I think about folks who lost their jobs. There's real loss in this right sizing. And I wonder if in getting smaller and scrappier and weirder, that American Christianity might find a kind of spiritual maturity that is not so closely aligned with white American middle class values. The sort of presumption of self-sufficiency. That I alone can fix this is a heresy we all really, really enjoy. Myself included.
Oh, myself, absolutely, yes.
But that's also the presumption of denominations.
The presumption of denominationalism? Wait a minute. What is Laura talking about? I want to pause here and have you focus in on this comment for 2 reasons. One is, I think it's really significant what she had to say, but also the reality is we got interrupted at that point, and so I needed to stop the recording. But the presumption of self-sufficiency, the idea that I alone can fix this, or, as people in denominations, that we can fix this. Some of you listening to this podcast might be in churches that have seen dramatic changes or gradual changes over time in terms of how your church functions. What do you do about it? What Laura is suggesting here is that we presume that if we can come up with the right strategy, the right program, that we alone can fix it. And the heresy of that, which is a pretty significant one in the life of the church, this might be the most significant heresy of modern Christianity, at least, is the presumption that we can do it and we don't need Jesus the Christ. We don't need God. We can just come up with the idea and the program and implement it on our own. Now, I don't know about you, but I heard this and I was convicted to the core, because this is quite candidly how I entered into this office almost 6 years ago. I didn't know it at the time. I wasn't doing it out of a sense of arrogance, but in reflection, I realize now, I thought I alone could fix this. Well, that lasted about 6 months. It should have only lasted about 6 days, but I'm a slow learner. In the next section, we're going to hear about some folks that are exploring it, and the ideas come from, well, not places that we would expect. So let's go back to our conversation with Laura Everett.
What I'm finding, let me say this, what I'm finding that's giving me the spiritual courage to follow where God's leading while trying to run a 115-year-old institution that's predicated on denominational particularity as found in middle-level judicatories, is actually a sense of the timelessness of the church.
Yep, I'm finding I read much more history of the church since being in this office than I ever did.
That's so interesting.
And by reading history, then I get that.
Yeah. For me, one of my commitments has been try to learn more about communities that I don't know well, as a way to make sure that my sense of what church is not just white mainline Protestant.
Right. So give me an example of what those communities. You're talking about like the Quakers and the way they do it, or are you talking about coffee shops and bicycle repair
No,
shops?
I mean, look, I think for me it's a global perspective that a robust understanding of what the church is requires me to think about, what does the church look like in Pakistan? What does the church look like in Brazil? What does the church look like in Ethiopia, not just now, but historically. And so if I can ground myself in a confidence that the gospel takes root in every culture and community, whether there's officially sanctioned support or not, whether there are buildings or not, whether there is learned clergy or not, whether there's full-time pastors or not. I think I've been mostly shaped by white mainline Protestantism, and that carries some pretty serious presumptions about pastoral leadership needing to be formed by a 3-year degree. But when you talk regularly with Christians from new immigrant communities, or Christians in other parts of the world, that is but one way to do church. I think about
one way forward is global. Who are global partners? What can we learn from them? Is that what you're saying,
and for me it's like I want to be in conversation with the widest parts of the body of Christ, because it reminds me that there are other ways to do church. And the way that I've been most familiar with doing church is not the only way.
Right.
So
Coptics. Let's talk about that, because that's a great example that you've been involved in.
Right. So I've gotten to know some of the Coptic community here in Massachusetts. The men who are called to the priesthood are generally tapped on the shoulder by their church. So I think about a friend who is a dentist. He grew up in Natick, trained as a dentist, works as a dentist, has a dental practice, and his church said, yeah, we're going to need you. And so he keeps his dental practice. Now, that is bivocational ministry, but it really upsets the sort of white mainline Protestant presumption that bivocational ministry or tent making or like whatever we tell pastors when they've been downsized is something you do as your B option.
Your supplemental income.
It's like, well...
Wow, that's fascinating.
Right? So now there are shortcomings to that model too, but to listen to the lived experience of Christian communities unlike my own is a good reminder for me that the way I've been doing it is not the only way to do it. So,
but that example really turns our model upside down.
Yep, that's right.
That's really fascinating.
And I think, look, they would say there are some real gifts in that and there are some real shortcomings.
You're not going to have perfection this side
of
heaven. So.
Right, right, but so part of what gives me confidence in the continuity of the church and whatever shape this all takes, that God's witness will continue through Christian community, is being in close communication and listening to stories of other Christian communities. Because, the guy who's driving cabs and during the week, or frankly, let's be clear, most of us are going to be driving for Uber and supplementing as supplemental income for quarter-time pastorates, that's not new.
Right.
It's new to white mainline well-educated Protestants, but either the Wesleyan itinerant model or the experience of new immigrants who are tapped on the shoulder to serve on Sunday mornings but have something else is really different than the sort of, well, we called you as a full-time ordained pastor and now we're dropping you down to 3/4 time, so good luck and go get a job at the coffee shop.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that is very different. That inverting of the whole thing of seeing somebody who has a career of some kind and then saying, yeah, we think God's calling you to do this. That changes everything. Because that changes our models of education, that changes a lot of different things. That's really fascinating.
Well, and I also think Sarah Drummond, who is I think she's the academic dean at Andover Newton at Yale Div, had once said to me in passing something to the effect of, the medical educational system has figured out some ways to educate for different levels of medical need. So we have RNs, we have licensed nurse practitioners, we have physician's assistants, we have medical assistants, we have MDs, we have MD PhDs. the church could do this. Like, we don't need all things, and I know everybody's going to, like, cite chapter and verse of books of discipline and
Well, some
agreements.
traditions have more flexibility in
Yeah.
that in other ways. So yeah, that's a really fascinating way to rethink about
Yeah.
that. So to wrap up now.
Yeah.
So I want to give you a chance to just, because we did a whole YouTube thing on your book on urban spirituality and bicycles and so forth and so on. Just kind of bring us up to date.
Yeah.
How's that going for you? Are you now on the bicycling urban spirituality talk show circuits? You know, because you were at at Wild Goose
Yeah.
In the
Yeah,
summertime,
yeah.
and so just kind of bring us up to date.
Yeah. It's been really interesting to me who has found common connection with Holy Spokes and the conversation I've been having about bicycling and urban spirituality. I found that pastors and church folk who already ride bicycles were like super jazzed about present company included, right?
Amen.
Like, like
Yeah.
this was the book.
Right.
That's been exciting, and there are a couple of pastors who have done sermon series and like adult ed, and that's just been really fun to watch. The cyclists, a good number of the cyclists that I've interacted with who would not identify as religious have said, and I take this as the highest compliment, that I was able to put into words something that they had experienced, that the way of a discipline of their body and that orders their life had an effect on their soul and their community.
Nice.
And that's just been a lovely affirmation, because I really did aim to write in a way that non-Christian audiences could find themselves in that story. What is curious to me is that the place that didn't seem to get any traction was among church folk who don't ride bicycles. And here's why. I was hoping that churches, Christians, pastors, folks who think about church vitality would take the story of Holy Spokes as an invitation to notice how people gather beyond Christian community. Now, that could be by bicycle, it could be by dinner club, it could be by CrossFit, it could be by a sewing circle. The bicycle is just sort of one example, but my hope was that churches, people who care about gathering community, would pay attention to what I was learning about how it's not even alternative, but how community forms outside of church, and learn from that. And it's been interesting to me that I don't see that happening.
Right. Well, I think that's an invitation to people that I can make, and maybe anybody listening right now you can read Holy Spokes, not as a Christian, not as a cyclist, but as a community leader, and go, where are people finding community? I mean, another book that gets at it in a different way that you gave me, which I think I still have your copy of, is Shopcraft as
Soulcraft.
Yeah. That's really cool.
Yeah.
Because I think there's also a whole thing, and we could talk. We don't have time to talk about it, but on blue collar folk and spirituality.
Yeah.
Because I think there's something that's
and
really
working with hands and what that
Yes,
means. Yep.
yes,
I think
and
that's right.
how we do
And how
that. And
information
that's what
gets
happen-
shared, and apprenticeship, and all of the ways,
Right.
those cross-generational learnings.
Yeah.
Here's the kicker. All of this wisdom is in our congregations. We're not just church people. We're like Christians who also ride our bicycles, and Christians who also go to the Sunday afternoon quilting bee, or the book club, or the cooking class. Like, we have all of this wisdom in our communities. Let's pay attention to what makes for strong and vibrant communities, and have enough spiritual humility to acknowledge we might be able to learn something from someone who is not in church.
Now that's the note we're going to end on.
All right. You're right. Let the people say amen.
Let people say amen. Thank you so much. This was fun.
Thanks for having me, Jen. Yeah, thanks. It's good.